Well, Andy and I were driving to go pick up our youngest daughter from school, and we were talking about all the different things about this podcast and our company. And Andy came up with an outstanding name for this podcast.
Welcome to the Level Up Fishing Podcast. We decided to come up with that name because as we brainstormed through everything, and we wanted this podcast to also tie back to our core values in our company, whether it's what we do guiding or what we do with our lures. What we also want to do with this podcast is help us and help you level up our fishing game. We want to go from the beginning to the top, and there's a lot of different levels to all this different stuff that we're going to bring to you. And so that's where we settled on the Level Up Fishing Podcast.
We are so excited about that. So, with that being said, we are going to talk about tube jig heads. And in our company alone, we have 8 different styles and 32 individual jigs. But between all of those, they come in two different line tie styles. So we're going to break those down and several different levels. So whether you're a beginner or you're advanced, everyone is going to get something from this.
So a tube jig in general is one of the oldest and most reliable and most across the board lures any angler can fish with for almost any species that swims almost any time of the year. But as you look at all the different options, like Stormy said, there's 32 different heads you can buy just from us, let alone all the other stuff on the market. It gets a little bit overwhelming, all the different choices and all the different whys for all the different tube jig heads. So we're here to break that down for you kind of piece by piece. And so today, just to kind of keep it short, because this could be a 3-week podcast all on tube jig heads, we're not going to do that all at once. So today we're going to talk about the line tie on the tube jig head itself.
So we offer 2 different styles, 60s versus 90s. Now, what and why?
So technically speaking, the 60 versus 90 is where the bend of the hook occurs on the shank and where you tie your line onto it. And so, in a simple sense, a 60-degree line tie basically is off at an angle out the front of the tube and out of the front of the lead of the tube jig head. And a 90-degree line tie, it's sticks straight up out of the tube body, out of the top of it, or straight up out of the lead from the tube jig head.
And they're for 2 different techniques.
So what's different there is how it balances your tube. And so that's really the difference between the two, is depending on the technique you want to employ, you will pick the line tie that will balance the tube in the way that you want it to.
Okay. So what does that mean?
So what that means is they were designed for 2 different techniques. The 60-degree head is designed to put the nose of the tube jig down, so it's very weighted forward because the line is tied on to the front of the jig. So all the weight's at the front of the tube jig head, so it noses down. Where a 90-degree head was designed to balance the tube jig in a horizontal plane or parallel to the bottom of the lake. So if we're talking the technique differences between the two, if you are casting and retrieving a tube, you want the tube to be in contact with the bottom of the lake for the entire retrieve. So you would want a 60-degree head because the nose will stay down into the bottom of the lake the entire time you're moving it. If you're vertically jigging a tube, you want that thing, the presentation that's the most natural is to have the tube horizontal or parallel to the bottom of the lake. So a 90-degree head balances your tube to where it'll sit flat.
And I found like when we're fishing, not only does that affect the technique you're obviously of what you want to do, but like the fish's temperament affects whether you use a 60 or 90 also. So say you have like skittish trout that don't want to go anywhere near your boat, casting your 60-degree out is much more effective than a vertical jig because they don't want to go near the boat. But if you are vertical jigging under the boat for, say, perch, who love structure and tend to hibernate under your boat when you're fishing, a 90-degree works great for that too.
So yeah, there's going to be scenarios and times of the year when you will be able to pick one or the other technique that's going to be the most effective. Ice fishing, you're pretty much limited to vertical jigging, so a 90-degree head is the preferred tube jig head when ice fishing because you are vertical jigging. But that same scenario also applies when you're fishing out of a boat or off a dock or off your kayak or your paddleboard, where you are locating fish underneath you and you're dropping a jig straight down to them. The best presentation of a tube is on a 90-degree head. And then on the other side of that is when, like for example, on our fishery here, when we want to go cast for trout in the spring or in the fall, a tube jig's one of our go-to methods because a lot of these trout are hunting crawdads that time of year because the crawdads are constantly on the move. In the spring, things are warming up, they're coming out of hibernation and they're crawling around all over the place, feeding and finding warm water. And then again, later in the fall, when they're crawling around all over the place, feeding up and then trying to find a good place to hibernate for the winter, we want to match the activity of the bait fish by casting and retrieving a tube where it mimics crawfish that are moving constantly across the bottom. So that would be one scenario where a 60-degree head when we're casting and retrieving is the one we want.
So just to recap, this is level 1, we'll call it, where 60-degree is your casting, 90-degree is your vertical jigging. That's kind of level 1. Now, moving on to level 2, this is where we kind of shift everything and put it on its head.
So once you sort of understand why each head was designed for the reason it was designed, you can actually use what may be considered the wrong head for a technique that you want to use. So for example, we were fishing a trout tournament one year and we noticed a lot of trout traveling up and down it was basically an underwater cliff. And on the top of the cliff it was like 4 feet deep, and at the bottom of the lake under the cliff it was like 20 feet deep. But we couldn't put the boat over the top of the fish or they would scatter. So what we learned that time was we wanted to vertically present a tube to those fish, but we couldn't do it under the boat, so we had to cast to them. We tried it with a 60-degree head, and because we were casting, but what was happening was the nose down presentation of a 60-degree head was dropping the tube too straight down and the fish weren't reacting to it. It just didn't look right to them. So always same tube body, same weight jig head, we just switched from a 60 to a 90. We're able to cast onto the shelf on top of the cliff, pull it off, and then drop it on a slack line. And because that head balanced that tube body in a more horizontal, more natural presentation on its way down, the fish began to bite. So that's a scenario where we understood that a 90-degree line tie head presented the bait in a much better way than a 60 in a casting scenario.
So now talk about 60 versus 90. Guys, he talked to me about this theory earlier, and I think I'm a damn good fisherman, and he still broke my brain with this one. We were talking about fishing from a boat versus casting from a shore. And we were discussing the 60, and it seems so simple when you think about it, but at the same time, it's not something I think every angler thinks about. So, talk about what you would do in those scenarios.
Yeah, good question. So that's another way that you can use their design to your advantage when you're put in a scenario where what it was designed for puts you at a disadvantage. So what I mean by that is in a normal circumstance, we cast a 60-degree tube head because we want the nose of the jig in the dirt all the time because that looks more natural. And the reason we don't cast a 90-degree head for that style of fishing is because when you lift or pull the tube that has a 90-degree head on it, it's hard to control where that tube goes because of the balance. And so it darts left and right for one thing, and for two, it picks it up off the bottom really fast, and so you lose bottom contact really quickly with a 90-degree head, because when you pull it, it just wants to almost float horizontal. So this is another scenario where understanding that you can use it for casting in certain situations. So what I do in the fall, we have caught some of our biggest lake trout historically ever from the fall from the bank. And so what we call that is you're actually fishing uphill. And when you cast from a boat to the bank and bring it back to your boat, you're fishing downhill. Because generally the slope of the bank changes depending on your angle. So if I'm throwing a 60-degree tube head from the bank and I'm casting it really far out into the lake, and it's 40 feet deep at the end of my cast, and it's 0 at my feet, I'm fishing that tube uphill. So if I'm pulling that thing and I want bottom contact with it, that's easy. But now I'm going to be snagging that thing constantly because I can't even get it off the bottom to move it because it's going uphill. It's just ramming the head of that tube into the rocks and into the structure the whole time.
That makes so much sense.
So because we understand that a 90-degree head lifts the tube off the bottom so much easier than a 60, we can use that to our advantage when fishing uphill. So now I can throw a tube out from the bank out into 40 feet of water with a 90-degree head, and I can actually present that same tube in a better way with a head that's not designed for that. Because when I pull it and I'm fishing uphill, the jig wants to come uphill. And so it's going to look a lot more natural, and I'm going to hang up and lose a lot less fish with that.
And vice versa from a boat.
Right.
I mean, you know, I don't know. We were talking about this in the car and while we were waiting to pick up our daughter, and I'm like, we need to re-record that whole podcast. We've re-recorded this one a couple of times because I really thought that was just such a good piece of information that anglers should know. Because yeah, you're like, okay, this is when you see it, you're like 60 degrees casting jig. Okay, that makes sense. I'm on the bank, I'm casting the jig. Why am I hanging it up on every single rock? Why do I keep losing all of my jigs and have to retie every 2 minutes? Well, that makes sense. Where, like, when you explain it, when you think about it, a 60-degree jig basically hops or crawls along the bottom where a 90-degree jig kind of swims, kind of darts and moves more like a fish versus a crawdad. So that, to me, I just thought that was such a good point.
Okay, so here is another next level technique for you to think about with tubes, and that is what we refer to as directing a tube. We had talked a little bit about the balance of the tube, making it pretty erratic and pretty hard to control where the thing lands or how and where it falls. So one other thing to bring up about the difference between a 60 and a 90 is if you tie on a 60-degree head and throw it out and let it free fall or sink on a slack line, that tube head is going to fall in a spiral pattern. So it's going to be nose down in a really tight circle, almost like a funnel from a tornado kind of shape. And then if you did the same exact thing with a tube on a 90-degree head, if you throw it out and let it sink on a slack line, you will see that head, because of the balance, for one, it falls slower, and for two, it makes big, wide circles. So there's a couple scenarios to think about there. One that we brought up was that a tube is a great choice for fishing for bass that are on beds. And so a 60-degree head actually is the preferred head choice for fishing bass on a bed because it falls in a much straighter line and more straight down. And if you fish for bass on beds before, you know that they get really specific sometimes to like a very small little spot on their big bed that they've made. And so the closer you can put your bait to that little spot in the bed, the more likely you are to trick them into biting. So a 60-degree head's going to help you, land that tube on the spot better. But another thing, this is a technique that takes a lot of practice, but we use it a lot through the ice, is if you can, and this takes a little bit of practice with the particular head and particular tube that you have tied on at the moment, but it goes back to like kind of putting the tube kind of in front of you and seeing what it does in the water before you ever even start fishing it. This will help you learn the fall rate, and we'll talk about weights of jig heads later. But with this technique, because a 90-degree head does such big, wide turning circles on a free fall, if you're able to put the right amount of line pressure on that jig head as it falls, you can actually directionalize where it goes. So we use this, it's hard to explain, but we use it through the ice sometimes where, sometimes lake trout fishing, simply lifting and dropping a tube doesn't always catch them. Like they've seen that, they've been there, done that, they know what that is, and they run off. But, it's easier to do in a boat when you can move your boat and then drag the tube jig along the bottom. But we really want to try to do that through the ice, but it's hard to do because you're fishing straight down. But if you put a 90-degree head on, which you would anyways because you're vertically jigging, you can actually put pressure on the line as the tube descends in the water column. And instead of it doing big circles, you can make it sort of plane in one direction and just hold that certain line pressure as it goes down. And you can actually get that tube to plane way outside of your hole bottom. So like you can it'll land like 10 feet to your right or your left of your hole.
That's so cool.
So then you're actually able to drag that tube when a when a fish comes in and is interested in your stuff, you can actually pull that jig along the bottom rather than just lifting it straight up and down.
That really is cool to see, just with a little shift in pressure and stuff that you can make it basically swim away from you while you're on the ice.
So that's 100 years ago when I started fishing, there was a lure that's like one of those like on TV lures that I bought that actually was built for this exact thing. They called it the flying lure. Oh. And it was a flat tube jig. Same hollow head with tentacles, but the plastic body itself was flat, not round.
Oh.
And the head of it had a ton of weight in the front of it. And so because of the flatness of the plastic, it would actually plane away from you. And so that's where that idea came from, because that they called it the flying lure, and that thing doesn't exist anymore. But you can make your tube jigs fly by putting a little bit of line pressure on it as it descends.
That is so fun. So that's level 2. Understanding what your jigs do in the water, how they move, and using that to your advantage, and not just saying 60s for casting, 90s for vertical jigging, but really understand the way they move, how they're designed, their weight forward design versus balance design, and using that to your advantage. Now let's move on to level 3. What if you only have what you have? Break that down for us.
So a lot of times you can be in a scenario where you have very limited tackle. So there's a lot of different examples. Say you're hiking into a backcountry lake, or you're going to a lake you've never been before, or you're a co-angler in a tournament and you're limited to 1 tackle bag and 5 rods. And you get out on the water and all of a sudden you realize, you're like, man, a tube today is going to be the deal. But I only brought like 10 heads, and they're all 60s, and they're all this certain weight. But we're vertically fishing for these things under the boat on top of a rock pile. How in the world am I going to present this bait properly? So by having a really in tune perspective on your equipment, on how the lure is supposed to work, on how the heads are supposed to work, you can actually change how they work with the equipment that you are provided, so to speak. So if your line's too heavy, or if your head is completely out of balance, or if you got totally the wrong size, like there's different things that you can do, understanding all of the little subtleties of the different heads and weights and balances and how the line affects it, to where you can use what you're given and make it work. But you have to start at level 1 and get a really good feel for how these things are supposed to work, so that you can go to the next level and then the next level and keep flipping it on its head and flipping it on its head. And then once you get to that point, you can get almost any tackle provided and make it work for you.
So this is that age old, there's an exception to every rule. Because if you have a really good understanding, you can make it work for you. You can make it work in any scenario, but you have to put the time in, you have to practice, you have to understand the feel of what you're feeling and visualize that. I do that all the time. You'll see me when I'm out there, and Andy will be like, he used to tell me that, visualize what your jig is doing. And I'm like, it's on the bottom. I don't know. You'll see me. The thing I do that helps a ton is I close my eyes and I just feel the weight of the rod in my hand, because as soon as your eyes are open, mine anyways, I'm looking at the mountains, I'm looking at what ducks are coming across the water. I'm not really paying attention. So I close my eyes, and I just focus on that jig. And so if you can give your tackle that focus, I think that is when you get to level 3 and you can flip everything on its head completely.
So one really good tip for you in any scenario with the tackle that you have in regards to tube jig heads is get the one you have, tie it on, and throw it 10 feet in front of you and watch it, and pull it towards you and watch it. Snap it, jerk it, swim it. Look at what that thing is doing, how it's reacting to the movement from your rod, how it's going off the bottom, back to the bottom, off the bottom, back to the bottom. Just spend an extra 30 seconds or a minute and just flip it out in front of you 10 or 15 feet so you can visually see it in the water, see how it's moving, and then when you bomb that cast out in the middle of the lake, remember that visual in your mind that entire cast, and then that'll give you a way better idea what that thing is supposed to look like in the water. And when you're messing around with it along the bank like that, you'll hit a jig motion or a little subtle twitch with your hand. You're like, ooh, that looks fishy to me, like that's the deal. And so you practice that a couple times when it's right there in front of you, and then now when you have so much more confidence when you bomb it out there to know that what you're doing with your rod with that particular head and lure looks like the right technique that's going to catch them.
I love it. I think that's where we end this one. I think there's so much just between the two line ties that can affect how you fish, and I love this. We have so much more to cover. We're gonna really just break down tube jig heads as a whole. We're gonna go into size and weight and the hooks and hook sets and all this, wire gauges, everything. We're gonna dive deep into all of it. If you guys ever have any questions, you can always message us on Facebook, Instagram. You can email us at info@gsofishing.com. We are always happy to help.
So go out there and start level up your fishing.